safety, prosperity, justice. These are the gifts that the power of a magical girl can provide, if you choose to access it. Just be warned that the price of doing so is a heavier burden than you could ever possibly imagine. Puella Magi Madoka Magica is a Japanese animated show about magical girls fighting evil and making friends along the way. It also happens to be a brutally harrowing character drama that thoroughly explores some of the most arduous and nuanced concepts that the human experience has to offer, including grief, corruption, the crippling weight of responsibility, and even the nature of the relationship between a corporeal body and the intangible soul that inhabits it, the dark implications of which I, among many other unsuspecting anime enthusiasts, was woefully unprepared for going into this innocent-looking fantasy series. On the surface, Madoka Magica seems like any other magical girl anime. In fact, for the first 2 episodes, it basically is. It's got a colorful aesthetic, adorable character designs, and a classic premise as old as the genre itself. Our protagonist Madoka Kaname was just a normal 14-year-old whose life was flipped upside down in a fateful encounter with a small merchandising opportunity. Small creature named Kyubey, who offered to transform her into a magical girl so that she could protect her loved ones from the destructive witches that terrorized the city. Madoka, along with her friend Sayaka, are treated to a first-hand demonstration of what exactly a magical girl is capable of when they stumble into a few of these monstrous witches, and a seasoned magical girl by the name of Mami Tomoe has to come to their rescue. She handedly defeats the witches in a dazzling display of powerful magic, which gives our principal duo of high schoolers a preliminary taste of what fantastical things this daunting world has to offer. But more than that, it also gives them an experienced mentor to aspire to. Not only does Tomoe teach them about the ins and outs of being a magical girl through words, but she also backs it up by performing incredible feats in battle. Everything about her fighting style exudes such grace and elegance that I hesitate to even call it fighting in the first place. You can really see Madoka and Sayaka's amazement at her ability to be simultaneously reliable and yet somehow artistic in the midst of I'm currently in the process of growing my hair back after having lost most of it over the course of watching this anime. Episode 3 of Madoka Magica is a masterclass in the subtle art of making a good plot twist. The most effective plot twists in my eyes are those that subvert the audience's expectations in a way that feels out of nowhere the moment it happens, but ultimately seems inevitable upon examining the context that built up to it. Tomoe's decapitation is a complete shock and a dramatically stark shift in tone, but believe it or not, it makes a lot of sense in hindsight. I mentioned earlier that the first 2 episodes of this series are the makings of a stereotypical magical girl storyline as far as surface level aesthetics go, but a closer look will actually reveal a few key hints into the reality that this show is not as harmless as it initially seems. Let's return to my previous explanation of the premise. Our protagonist Madoka Kaname was just a normal 14-year-old whose life was flipped upside down in a fateful encounter with a small, cute little gremlin guy. Small creature named Kyubey, who offered to transform her into a magical girl so that she could protect her loved ones from the destructive witches that terrorized the city. Alright, pause. These destructive witches are not just your run-of-the-mill villains that you might see in Sailor Moon or the Powerpuff Girls. They're much more grotesque and unnatural in both behavior and phenotype, equipping the central conflict with a sense of horror which is uniquely contrasted with the rest of the established atmosphere thus far. They give me a vibe of uncanny dread, not dissimilar to what I felt as a kid whenever SpongeBob would suddenly cut to a hyper-realistic version of the current scene to emphasize the lunacy of a particular scenario. Seriously, was anyone else acutely disconcerted by these cutaways, or is that just me? At any rate, these things are mega terrifying even without their appearance. I mean, their go-to method of terrorism seems to be hypnotizing people into committing suicide. And Let's just say you're not going to see anything like that in Cardcaptor Sakura. Another example of subtle foreshadowing that I actually find to be far more poignant than the witches is the nature of Kyubey's offer in and of itself. What makes this contract so fascinating is that it completely reframes the connotation behind the very concept of a magical girl as we know it. Usually, whenever the whole fairy godmother bestowing magic upon the powerless protagonist cliche appears, the magical powers are the reward for the responsibility that comes with them. But in Madoka's case, allowing her to have a wish granted implies that becoming a magical girl is not the reward, but rather the price that must be paid for the wish. Of course, another way to interpret this is that becoming a magical girl still entails the expected benefits, but the responsibility is so great that the wish serves as compensation for that. Either way, it works perfectly as a subliminally ominous warning for the darkness ahead, and we'll actually discover later on that there's truth to both of these interpretations. The main point that I wanted to get across here is that this show flips one of the most common fantasy tropes on its head by taking the call to adventure, which is normally presented as hopeful and empowering, and instead presenting it as somewhat Faustian and sinister. And as you may have guessed by now, this is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to tropes being flipped on their head. At its core, Madoka Magica is a deconstruction of the magical girl genre. Sorry for the dead air, I just wanted to leave some time for you to clean up after vomiting just now. Look, I'm well aware of the gross, historic, and dare I say monolithic bastardization of the word deconstruction in the zeitgeist of YouTube video essays, and I will be among the first to criticize the misuse of this infamous term, but believe me when I say that this anime is a truly genuine modern example of deconstructing a genre right down to its fundamental characteristics. Over the course of a remarkably swift runtime of 12 episodes, this series manages to take apart every defining trait of magical girl anime, integrate them in a plot that makes narrative and mechanical sense, and stretch them to their logical extremes in an epic overarching culmination that sincerely left me dumbfounded by the end of it. And if you've ever had the misfortune of being on the receiving end of one of my anime-related rants, it shouldn't come as a surprise when I say that a large contributor to that is the power system. Madoka Magica's power system, in essence, is based on emotion. In particular, hope and despair. Now, before you write this off as some kind of boneheaded power of friendship Danganronpa ripoff, just hear me out for a sec. It's really clever, I swear. So I'll use Sayaka as an example, since her transformation is the first time we get to see the process in action. When Kyubey grants her wish, the conditions of the contract are met, and Sayaka becomes a magical girl. This consequently triggers the creation of her soul gem, which is a physical manifestation of her newfound magical powers. Notably, the nature of a magical girl's powers are directly determined by their wish. Sayaka wished for her friend in hospice to recover from his paralysis, and so her powers are based on healing and general defensive proficiency, as well as being the best character in the show. Okay, so magical girls get to have a wish granted, and they gain powers based on what they wish for. So what's the catch? Well, it turns out that using their magical powers actually corrupts their soul gem little by little, and if they don't purify it in time, it's entirely overtaken by darkness and becomes what's known as a grief seed, which causes the magical girl to irreversibly transform into a witch, the very thing they originally swore to destroy. So naturally, that begs the question, how does one purify their soul gem? Well, whenever a witch dies, the grief seed from its birth is left in its wake. If a magical girl is able to defeat a witch and obtain its grief seed, they can replenish their soul gem by having the grief seed absorb its corrupted energy. The problem is that grief seeds are actually kind of hard to come by. You see, whenever a witch is born, if the explosion of dark energy from the corrupted soul gem is strong enough, it also produces several weaker creatures called familiars, which are much more common than witches, and they don't drop grief seeds when they die. However, if they go around killing humans for long enough, familiars can eventually evolve into witches. And this actually leads to a really interesting moral dilemma involving the ethically troubled magical girl Kyoko, who ends up deliberately allowing a familiar to go kill more humans so that she can acquire its grief seed after evolving. Now, the question we should be asking at this point is, why is Kyubey doing this? The only reason these evil witches exist in the first place is because of the magical girl contract. They fight witches, corrupt their soul gems, transform into witches themselves, and the vicious cycle begins anew, so why start it to begin with? Well, as it happens, and bear with me on this, Kyubey is a member of an emotionless alien race called incubators, and they've become fascinated with human beings because of their capacity to feel emotions, the most consistently intense of which seem to come from the demographic of teenage girls. Statistically based sexism aside, the incubators have actually discovered a way to convert these emotions into energy. The way it works is whenever a prospective magical girl makes her wish to fulfill the contract, the hope that they feel for getting their wish granted is stored inside their soul gem. However, the more spooky murderous witches they have to fight against, the more their soul gem fills with despair. And if it becomes entirely corrupted, incubators like Kyubey step in right at the moment they transform into a witch and harvest all of the immense energy that's expelled in the process of hope fusing into concentrated despair. It's a completely renewable and profoundly unethical energy source that they utilize to, and I quote, counteract the effects of entropy. You know, it's kind of like one of those win-win situations. Except if one of the wins was a lose instead. By the way, the incubators have apparently been making these contracts with humans for literal millennia. It is heavily implied through a visual montage that Anne Frank, Joan of Arc, and Cleopatra were all magical girls. I'm going to have to try very hard not to make this show my new personality. Anyways, my end goal in explaining this power system was not just to rave ad nauseum about the convoluted mechanics of a fictional universe, although that was a wonderful perk that's always welcomed with open arms on this channel, but I specifically wanted to discuss one especially enthralling application of it, which I personally found to be even more bone-chilling than Tomoe's death. And that is the scene on the bridge in episode 6. To provide some context for this scene, the moral conflict between Kyoko and Sayaka has reached a fever pitch, and they're about to start fighting again. This naturally upsets Madoka because she rightfully believes that magical girls should try to get along with each other since they already go through enough as it is, so in order to stop them from fighting, Madoka takes Sayaka's soul gem and throws it off of the bridge. She presumably did this in an attempt to take away her magical powers so that they wouldn't have a reason to fight anymore, but in a gut-twisting, haunting turn of events, Kyubey tells her, "You just threw away Sayaka." Sure enough, the camera shows Sayaka's face, and we can see the life drain from her eyes as she collapses in a motionless heap on the ground. It's getting there. Kyubey explains to them that when a magical girl contract is completed, their power is not the only thing that's stored inside their soul gem. No, it's much more than that. During their transformation into a magical girl, their very soul is sucked out of their body and housed in the gem. And if it ever gets farther than 100 meters away, their body will be reduced to nothing more than a limp husk, devoid of life. I think what really made this hit home for me was a previously shown conversation between Madoka and her mother. She asks her mom for advice on how to help a misguided friend who's hurting, obviously referring to Sayaka, and despite her mother's ignorance of the magical shenanigans surrounding Madoka, she manages to provide rather sagacious advice in this remarkably well-written sequence of dialogue. Her ultimate stance on the matter is that Madoka has always been responsible and obedient, almost to a fault at times. And we don't have to take her word on this, by the way. Madoka's obedient nature is evident through her actions and mannerisms in the first half of the show. But her point is that maybe she should try to take the initiative and assert herself more in the interest of pushing her friend in the right direction, despite her natural tendency to be the accommodating one in the relationship. And in most other stories, this would be when the main character acts on their mentor's advice and saves the day as a result. But instead, Madoka's attempt to take the initiative and assert herself leads to one of the most grim, terrifying, and hopeless scenes that I have ever experienced as an anime viewer. Thankfully, Homura is able to step in and retrieve the soul gem to revive Sayaka, but after what happened in episode 3, I no longer had any trust in this show to keep its characters safe. Not even Sayaka. Which is crazy because she's obviously the best character in the show. Speaking of characters though, holy cow, the side characters in this show are so compelling. I mean, obviously the majority of the story's character development comes from the magical girls, but I was profusely impressed with the level of respect this series has for its background cast. I briefly mentioned Sayaka's hospitalized friend Kyosuke during the power system explanation, but he's actually one of the most interesting aspects of Sayaka's arc. You see, the real tragedy behind his left hand being paralyzed is that he can no longer pursue his passion of playing the violin. and the reason Sayaka always goes to the record store after school is so she can bring an album to the hospital and listen to classical music with him. And it would have been easy to just show them quietly bonding over a copy and pasted track of Ave Maria, but they really go above and beyond to illustrate his anguish ever since the accident. In a moment of weakness, he accuses her of torturing him with music that he'll never be able to create again, and smashes his hand on the record player. Of course he feels remorseful after the fact, but it gives us a glimpse into his internal turmoil that really humanizes him in a realistic, believable way. We as people are fluid beings, and our grief often manifests in multiple, potentially contradictory ways. Kyosuke holds a deep love for music, but now that he's been barred from contributing to that world, his love has inevitably morphed into a resigned and bitter hatred, which, in a cruel twist of irony, is only exacerbated by his passion for it. Also, they did not have to go that hard with Madoka's parents. Not only do they offer great advice, but they also have their own struggles, their own convictions, their own enrapturing complexity. And while we're on the topic of characters, I would be remiss not to discuss the character arc of Sayaka Miki. Now, the intriguing thing about Sayaka that you may not have considered before is that she's actually the best character in the show. Sayaka Miki, in the span of 9 20-minute episodes, undergoes one of the most dynamic, layered, compelling, and beautifully tragic character arcs I have ever seen in television. And I've seen Rico in The Penguins of Madagascar. When we first meet Sayaka, she's established as the spunky, upstanding member of her friend group, and although her cheerful innocence is understandably sullied after witnessing the graphic murder of Tomoe, her integrity remains as she makes the noble wish to heal Kyosuke's paralyzed hand, consequently committing herself to the life of a magical girl. However, she continues to grapple with the guilt that she feels over this decision. She fears that the only reason she wished for Kyosuke's recovery was to make him like her. Nonetheless, her optimistic attitude and strong moral compass persist as she fights witches and stands her ground against Kyoko, almost at the risk of being slightly arrogant in her self-righteousness in the case of the latter conflict. But despite not being totally convinced of it herself, her heart is in the right place. That is, until the night she finds out that Kyubey put her spirit inside of the soul gem. As one final twisted development of the power system, Kyubey explains to her that since the source of her soul and her magical power are now one and the same, she can use her unique defensive abilities that she got from wishing for Kyosuke's recovery to quell the pain that she endures in combat almost entirely. The caveat is that if she relies on this technique excessively, she could end up disassociating body from spirit and permanently dulling her reaction time. Sure enough, when Sayaka is pushed to her physical limit in a vicious battle against the witch Elsa Maria soon afterward, she uses her powers to suppress the pain. And it works. This is the moment where Sayaka cracks. Slashing the witch in two, she feels no triumph, no fulfillment, only emptiness. She tosses the grief seed away because she knows that it's pointless to put a band-aid over a bullet wound. And just like she pushed away her pain, Sayaka pushes away her friends, pushes away herself as she succumbs to the numbness, spiraling into an abyssal void of nihilistic despair as she transforms into a witch. There are so many more components of Sayaka's character, as well as this series in general, that I haven't touched on in this video, and I encourage everyone out there who's not too squeamish about existentialism to give this anime a try. There's something so grippingly artistic about how this show conveys its characters as they lose their precious innocence over the course of its run, and if I covered every little aspect of its artistry, then I would still be writing this godforsaken script as we speak. Hell, I didn't even talk about arguably the most important character to the entire plot, that being the time traveler Homura Akemi. Yep, that's right, this show has time travel in it too. And they didn't even screw it up, which is more than I can say about 99% of fictional media featuring time travel. Seriously though, the way they retroactively unravel and recontextualize Homura's role in the story, particularly as she relates to Kyubey, is nothing short of genius. I guess the overall thesis that I want to wrap this up with is that not only is Madoka Magica one of the most emotionally layered stories I've ever come across in fantasy, but it also rigorously explores and, in turn, subverts every single archetypal element of the genre in the process. You know those cute little creatures that always guide the protagonist in the ways of magic through their wisdom? Yeah, let's make that the villain of the story. You know those generic forces of evil that threaten humanity and antagonize the main cast? let's actually explain where they came from and invent an entire extraterrestrial race of beings with an entropy-related energy crisis to make the conflict believable. You know that obligatory moment where the protagonist transforms and learns how to harness their power? Let's wait until the last episode of the show to pull that one out. Needless to say, this anime's unconventional approach and unapologetic willingness to showcase the good, the bad, the ugly, and the gut-wrenchingly disturbing of what a world with magical girls would truly be like has certainly been etched into my brain in a viewing experience that I will never forget, as long as I live. And although Sayaka's story ultimately ended in tragedy, she truly lived without a modicum of regret, because for every pang of despair that came with her fate as a magical girl, there was a boy out there who felt the miracle of hope. And it makes one wonder, if not for a fleeting moment, that maybe it was all worth it. Maybe the true magic of a magical girl was the wish that started it all.